Well, the last thing we did was Passover. So this kind of teaching, it comes out of I know this is going to sound weird, but it comes out of a dream that I had, and it was just a reminder of this place in Scripture. Because I was kind of asking them like, hey, where do you want us to go next? And so this is kind of where we ended up. So when you look at the route here that they came out of Egypt, right in here is where we're going to basically focus. It's when they got into the region of Arabia, and that's where sort of the focal point's going to be. I put this in here because it actually makes a lot of sense. I didn't draw this, but this is similar to the path that they took. You see all those squigglies? You're having a bad day when you do all those squigglies. It's less than desirable. But to be honest with you, there's a lot of people that kind of look at the wilderness experience and they think, man, why did it take them so long? But it takes us a while too, in a lot of ways. And so it's easy for us to sit here and say, man, look at these people. But really, we're kind of going through this sort of thing too, in a lot of ways, in some degree or another. But just to clarify, where it says Mount Horeb somewhere in here, that's the region of Midian where we're going to kind of be covering today. The first one that we're going to look at is Deuteronomy 18. This is just to kind of set the tone here. But it says the Levitical priest, this is in 18:18. I'm sorry, 18:1. It says the Levitical priest, the whole tribe of Levi, shall not have a portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the Lord's offerings by fire and his portion. They shall not have an inheritance among their countrymen, because the Lord is their inheritance, as he has promised them. Now this shall be the priest's portion from the people, from those who offer a sacrifice, either an ox or a sheep, and they shall give the priest the shoulder, the two cheeks, and the stomach. And you shall give him the first fruits of your grain, your new wine, and your oil, and the first fleece of your sheep. For the Lord your God has chosen him and his sons from all your tribes to stand to serve in the name of the Lord always. Now, if a Levite comes from any of your towns throughout Israel, where he resides, and he comes wherever he desires to the place which the Lord chooses, then he shall serve in the name of the Lord his God, like all his fellow Levites who stand there before the Lord. And they shall eat equal portions, except for what they receive from the sale of their father's estates. Yes.
Are you offline?
Yeah.
Oh, just making sure the internet went out.
Oh, yeah, we're good. Man, I really kind of jacked that one, didn't I? Well, yeah, we'll just deal with it for today. I had to throw this together pretty quick. So, but when you enter the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of the nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire. And this is all surrounding the worship of Molech and some of the fertility cults, or one who uses divination. This is the conjuring of spirits or speaking to the dead. Soothsayer, so this is witchcraft, fortune telling, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who consults the dead. For whoever does these things is detestable. And this is akin to like what we would call an open marriage. So like you're married, but your marriage is open so that you're free to do other things with other people. Yes, that's the family-friendly version, yes. But that's what that's akin to, is like, they made a covenant, but then they find themselves doing all these other things, and he sees it like an open marriage. Like we've broken the covenant, we've broken the wedding vows. And then it continues here and it says, because of these detestable things, the Lord your God is going to drive them out before you. This is the nations. You are to be blameless before the Lord your God, for these nations which you are going to dispossess, they do listen to soothsayers and diviners. But as for you, the Lord has not allowed you to do so. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen, and to him you shall listen. This is in accordance with everything that you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, do not let me hear the voice of the Lord my God again, and do not let me see this great fire anymore, or I will die. This is the sword of Sinai piece. And the Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up for them a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them everything that I command him. And it shall come about that whoever does not listen to the words which he speaks in my name, I myself will require it of him. But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, a word which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall be put to death. And if you say in your heart, how will we recognize the word which the Lord has not spoken? It's when the prophet speaks in the name of God and the thing does not happen or come true. That is the thing which the Lord has not spoken, and that prophet has spoken it presumptuously, and you're not to be afraid of him. So when in Israel's history and even our history, when it has been spoken presumptuously, it basically is talking about overstepping bounds. The word there in the Hebrew is to boil over with pride. And so it's like assuming something will happen. It may be like the best case scenario or something that pleases the people's ears, and then they will speak those things regarding people, nations, and events. So that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about a little bit. We're going to talk about idolatry in Midian and kind of some of the history leading up to it. So if you look this word up, it literally means an idol or an image. Speaking of idolatry, and it can mean a number of things actually, but I kind of just threw some stuff in there that sort of encapsulates it a little bit. So it could be a man or an image of a man or animal even that has taken the place of God among the people. It can also be a man-made image that represents God. It can also be an object made by human hands that represents God. It can also be a visible object that humans make that allegedly represents God. It can be any representation of God that he never prescribed, right? It can be the worship of God in any way man sees fit. And so, unfortunately, we see a lot of that throughout the history of Israel. We don't often think about it like that today because much like they didn't think much of it either back then, we don't think much of it today either in terms of honoring God in a way that he prescribes, because it's just what we've grown up with our whole lives. Hey, what's up, man? So that, we just don't think about it, basically, is what I'm getting at. And so you grow up and maybe you're raised in a certain tradition or maybe a certain flavor of Christianity or whatever. You just don't think about it, It's only when people start reading the Bible that they begin to think about these things. But really, when you start looking at it, this is pretty much the biblical definition of it. There's some other flavors in there too, but we're just kind of going to cover the most obvious. So we have a history of it. Israel has a history of it. If there's any people group on the planet that shouldn't have had a history of it, it should have been Israel, right? And you can also make the same case for us today because we have access to so much information. We have access to so much data. But nonetheless, this is it's kind of where we find ourselves, unfortunately. So after the flood, you have the rise of Nimrod. Would you look his name up? It really is a name that is like rebellion oriented. They used to call him the rebel or the valiant one. So the people settled in the plain of Shinar. That's modern day Babylon. Plain of Shinar, Babylon. So when they built the Tower of Babel, they wanted to build a tower that reached into heaven. They said, let us build ourselves a city whose top will reach into heaven. Let's make a name for ourselves. When you look this word up, name, in the Hebrew language, it's pronounced shame, which is interesting, right? It's not the actual Hebrew word, but the way that you pronounce it in Hebrew is shame. So if you were to read that again, it's let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let's make a shame for ourselves. It's just interesting. I thought you guys might find that interesting. I know I did. Just interesting, the language. So Nimrod was basically the first great leader after the flood. You had Noah and his sons, and of course the animal kingdoms, and then one of his sons went on. A descendant was basically Nimrod. So in Babylon, you had Nimrod and Semiramis. So when you start looking at Semiramis and Nimrod, there's quite a bit of information. There's quite a bit of disinformation too, though. It's the problem. So trying to track this thing back it can be difficult to do. But the historian Eusebius, he identified Semiramis as the wife of Nimrod. And so there's a lot of people that place, a lot of clout with Eusebius, and they believe that this is actually the way it was. But later she was referred to as the Queen of Heaven. So the cultures of the nations, they ascribe many names to her. You can find this all throughout Scripture. You can find Astarte, you can find Ishtar, the cult of Diana, etc. This is all probably paying homage to the original Queen of Heaven, alleged Queen of Heaven, which is Semiramis. When you start digging further into this, you'll find that a lot of the fertility cults that emerged later that had feminine aspects attached to them, they're probably actually referring to her. So Nimrod and Semiramis go together like Baal and Asherah. In fact, you can actually make the case historically that when you're talking about Baal and Asherah, you're really talking about another rebranded version of Nimrod and Semiramis. Nimrod, the rebel builder of cities, he wanted to prove what man could accomplish in the face of calamity. We've heard these sayings all throughout history, no matter how far back you go. But one of the things is we will rebuild. Catastrophe happens, we will rebuild. The most recent iteration of this is we'll build back better. And I don't know. Seems to me like it's not going all that well, personally. But he was seen as the first great ambitious leader after the flood. You got to kind of put yourself in the shoes of Israel. They just went, there's a huge catastrophe. And people are sort of looking for some sort of solid footing somewhere. And they find it, unfortunately, in Nimrod. Let's see. Yeah. So when you look into the scholarly works, I can put a bunch of quotations here. It doesn't really matter. But they believe that when you find a male and female component, it's probably actually referring to the original Nimrod and Semiramis. So I did put something in here from Flavius Josephus. This is his commentary on it. He was the Jewish historian. We talked about him before. And it says, now the sons of Noah were three. You had Shem, Japheth, and Ham, born 100 years before the deluge. These first of all descended from the mountains into the plains, and they fixed their habitation there. And they persuaded others who were greatly afraid of the lower grounds on account of the flood, and so were very loath to come down from the higher places to venture to follow their examples. Now the plain in which they first dwelt was called Shinar. This is Babylon. It's another name for it. God also commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth. This is, be fruitful and multiply, that they might not raise seditions among themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth and enjoy its fruits after a plentiful manner. But they were ill instructed that they did not obey God, for which reason they fell into calamities, and were made sensible by experience of what sin they had been guilty. For when they flourished with a number of people, God admonished them again to send out their colonies. But they, imagining the prosperity they enjoyed was not derived from the favor of God, but supposing that their own power was the proper cause of the plentiful condition they were in, They did not obey him. That is a huge run-on sentence, but basically what it's saying is everything that happened, they ascribed the fruitfulness of it to their own power, to themselves. So they added to their disobedience to the divine will the suspicion that they were therefore ordered to send out separate colonies, that being divided asunder, that they might more easily be oppressed. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. And he persuaded them not to ascribe this success to God, as if it was through his means that they were happy, and to believe that it was. To believe that it was their own courage which procured their happiness. He also gradually changed the government into a tyranny. So this is right after the flood, man. This is what's happening. See no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power, you know? And this is what we see of governments all over the world. So it would be it's no surprise that Nimrod did it. I mean, the people probably didn't even mind it so much. They were looking to be led by somebody. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. Now, this is from Flavius Josephus. This is, when you start talking about history, there's two books that are primarily used. The first one is the Bible, and then the second one are his works in that time period. So what Josephus is saying is that this was the state of affairs with Nimrod and the people. Now, the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. In other words, they were saying that it would be cowardice of us if we listened to what God had to say and submit ourselves to him. And so they built a tower. They spared no expense, basically, nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could expect. But the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built, that its height seemed upon the view to be less than it really was. So it was so wide that it really didn't look as tall as it actually was. So he goes on to say here, well, we'll just read it. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar, made of bitumen, that it might not be liable to admit water. So they wanted to build it to where it was waterproof. And when God saw that they had acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of the former sinners. But he caused a tumult among them by producing in them diverse language, and causing that through the multitude of these languages, that they should not be able to understand one another. And this is exactly the account that's given in the Bible. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of the language which they readily understood before, for the Hebrews mean by the word Babel, confusion. And so when you look the word Babel up, the root of Babylon, you will see that it literally means confusion, because that's where the languages were confused. Goes on to say that the city that eventually was built was also called Babylon. So this is one of the accounts, but believe it or not, the Cherokee Indians have their own account. This is not probably very well known, but the Cherokee Indians mentioned a time when a great flood was threatening their lands, and they decided to construct a huge tower reaching to the heavens. And they're quoted here as saying, when we lived beyond the great waters, there were 12 clans belonging to the Cherokee tribe. Interesting. And back in the old country in which we lived, the country was subject to great floods. So in the course of time, we held a council and decided to build a storehouse that reached to heaven. This is the Cherokee Indians' account. It's crazy. What you'll find when you start looking around is that every culture, every civilization has a story of the flood. These are just a few. But the Cherokees said that when the house was built and the floods came, the tribe would just leave the earth and go to heaven. That was what they thought. And so we commenced to build a great structure, and when it was towering into one of the highest heavens, the great powers destroyed the apex, cutting it down to about half of its size. But as the tribe was fully determined to build to heaven for safety, they were not discouraged, but commenced to repair the damage done by the gods. Finally, they completed the structure, and they were safe from the floods. But after it was completed, the gods again destroyed the high part, and they determined to repair the damage, but they found that the language of the tribe was confused and or destroyed. This is Cherokees, man. Crazy. Choctaws have one too. The Choctaw have a story of the Tower of Babel. Their creator god, Abba. So it's missing a B here, but they're talking about the same individual. Originally made all people to speak the same language, but they became curious and started to build a pile of rocks to reach the sky. Each night the wind blew the rocks down, separating the people into different groups, until on the fourth day the people found that they were unable to understand each other. They scattered to form the many North American tribes, each of which spoke a different language and were thereafter in conflict with one another. So this is the Cherokees. You have Josephus's account, you have the Choctaw account, but I mean, you can go through the litany of the existing civilizations, even the ones that don't exist so much anymore, and dig through their literature, and you'll find this story of the Great Flood and the Tower of Babel. Did you want to get that? Okay, you're good. I just didn't want to fast forward. You're good. So, roughly 100 years after the flood, the Tower of Babel emerges. The city continues to be built, but the people are trying to make a name for themselves. The rebellion continues. So what we're going to do now is fast forward to the time of Gideon. So this is 1,000 years later. This is 1,000 years after, roughly 1,000 years after the Tower of Babel. The account of Gideon, it takes place in Oprah. It's not Oprah. So when you Google this word, you're probably going to get a lot of pictures of Oprah, which is not what you're... This is not, not what we're looking for. Gideon's hometown, he's got the Midianites and also the Amalekites to deal with. So the Midianites is a pretty interesting culture. They're actually descendants of Abraham through Keturah, though, not through Sarah. And it would be modern present day Saudi Arabia. The northern part is where the Midianites are from. And so they eventually became enemies of Israel. Then you have the Amalekites, the descendants of Amalek. These were from Esau. So, sort of the history of Esau there, but he traded his birthright for a bowl of soup during the time of Isaac, which is the father of Jacob and Esau. And it was in Esau's heart to kill his brother. And you can find that in Genesis 27. But this was the first people group to fight against Israel when they came out of Egypt during the Exodus, the Amalekites. And this was the time of Moses and Joshua. This would be like southern Canaan. Exodus 17:16 says that the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. So if you're not sure like who that people group is, you can make a lot of assumptions and try to discern current events through that lens. Current events in Israel. So I included this because this is like straight from the Britannica. It's like, and it's also been fact checked too. If you see that there, so we're okay to share this. But the Amalekites, they were an ancient nomadic tribe, and that's going to be the key phrase here because they constantly want a piece of ground for themselves, but they're nomadic in nature, and so that ground is like the shifting sands. But it's a collection of tribes, enemies of Israel. They've always been enemies. They were closely related to Ephraim, one of the 12 tribes. But the district over which they reigned was south of Judah and probably extended into northern Arabia. And this is sort of the area that we're talking about. It says here that their final defeat occurred in the time of Hezekiah, but when you start looking around, you can kind of make the case that may or may not be true. So when you look at the Midianites, because this is where the scripture focuses that we're going to be looking at, I just wanted to kind of get this out there so that you can understand what we're going to read a little better. But the Midianites actually worshipped Yahweh, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, right? But the problem was is that they had borrowed the religious practices from the Moabites and also the Ammonites, who worshiped Baal Peor. So you could say that they worshiped Yahweh through the personhood of Peor. Peor was the image of Yahweh, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, if you want to say it that way. And along with the image, there were alternate practices that took place among the people. So this is sort of what we were talking about before. You can worship God well enough, but if you do it in a way that he never prescribed or in a way that you see fit, he classifies that as idolatry, you know? So it's just something to be aware of. But Baal Peor, when you look at this word, Baal, you can go as deep as you want to in this. You could literally spend like 5 days just looking at this, but the name Baal means Lord or Prince. He was a Canaanite or Phoenician, because there's not a whole lot of history on the Canaanite people, but there is a lot of history on the Phoenician people. And so when you look at the Phoenicians, you're really looking at the extended version of the Canaanites. But he was the god of strength and of fertility, and also the god of sun and storms. Their worship system was all about having fertile land and fertile bodies too. But he was called the Prince, or the Lord of the earth, the Lord of the rain and the dew. The proper name for him in this region, because there's varying degree, there's the name changes with the culture. So that's the same place, or that's the same case with Baal, and then also Asherah. We'll get to that. But here he would have been referred to as Chemosh. So Peor is really talking about like a region, and it's a mountain peak in Moab, which is east of the Jordan River, and it is really talking about the god of the region. Because when you start looking at the history of that region, it is very regional. Like you'll have a lot of different varying degrees of worship, and then names and everything else. So it can be a little bit difficult to sort through some of that stuff. But Baal Peor would probably have been what the people referred to as Chemosh. And the people had developed cultural and also customary practices for worshiping this deity, which would eventually evolve into a system of worship. But the cults of Chemosh engaged in child sacrifice as a way to appease him. So this is not the only civilization to result in child sacrifice. I mean, you can go throughout history and look at it. But it's probably the same as Molech or Moloch of the Ammonites. And what we were saying before is it probably goes all the way back to Nimrod, unfortunately. And Nimrod is representative of somebody too. And it's a shifting sands. But the scripture says in 1 Kings 11, it says, "Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abhorrent idol of Moab, on the mountain that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abhorrent idol of the sons of Ammon." So there's a good chance of talking about the same thing here. The unfortunate thing, though, is for all of the great writing that we have access to from Solomon, he fell into it too. You know, so wisdom is good, but wisdom does not always keep you safe from this sort of thing. It's terrible. So this is probably, this is definitely a representation of Chemosh or Molech. Here's another one. This basically what they would do is they would build these big bronze statues. You can see it here a little bit better, but in the back you can see those dudes loading fire into the back of his keister there. And basically what they're doing is they're heating up this big bronze idol, and they heat it up to the point to where when they offer their kids on it, the death is pretty quick, and that's used to be what they did. And they're blowing trumpets and having a good time. The one on the right there is another representation. This is an artist rendering based on a manuscript that kind of describes another variant of this. So this is what the people were engaged in, The trouble is, though, is that they were saying it was for Yahweh. It was for Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. That's how far it had gone. You know, here's another one. You got the guys loading the wood up, and then obviously the children being offered there. And I know this is graphic and it's a difficult conversation to have, but this is just what the people of that time period were engaged in. You know, it's terrible. But then we move on to Asherah. It's references as the Asherim, the Ashereth. You've got a number of different variants of it, depending on the translation of the Bible that you're reading. So she was the wife of Baal. Remember, we were talking about Nimrod and Semiramis. So here you've got Baal and Asherah, and they were often presented together. You can also refer to this to her as Astarte. There's also references to Ishtar, some of the other fertility cults. It goes on and on and on. But the way that they characterized her was with sacred pillars or sacred poles. They called them the Asherah poles. And these trees produced fruit. That's the way that they viewed it, because they looked at trees and they thought, okay, well, this makes sense because we've got these fruit trees here and they produce fruit, right? Well, when you humanize that, as one section of the scripture does, where it says, I saw men in the garden as trees, you're kind of, it's a representation of a person. These trees and their fruit was a representation of the person and the personhood of Asherah. And that's why they would plant these trees near the altar of God, which we were told not to do. In Deuteronomy 16:21, it says, you shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree beside the altar of the Lord, which you shall make for yourself. And you shall not set up for yourself a memorial stone, which the Lord your God hates. 1 Kings 14:23 says it like this. It says, they also built for themselves high places and sacred pillars and Asherim on every high hill and beneath every luxuriant tree. So this was just practices of the people during that time period. This is what they should have done here. You can tell he's already destroyed the memorial stone, but he's in the process of chopping that bad boy down, which is a very good thing. Here's some more representations of Asherah as found throughout some of the cultures. It's interesting. There's some sort of vivid symbology there if you sort of look closely. Want to try to keep this family friendly here. But most of the if you're around your kids, don't Google Asherah. Yeah. Because you're going to see a lot of imagery that is not. I mean, it belongs on HBO After Dark or something. I don't even know if that's still a thing, but that's where it belongs. But Baal and Asherah were man-made representations of the gods that they worshipped. So, as mentioned previously, for those that believed in Yahweh, the people would also make these images as a way to represent him on the earth. So when you think about what they were doing, they were setting up these images, which they were commanded not to do. They were trying to humanize God. That's what they were trying to do. And they were trying to make for themselves a way to represent him on the earth, and they would do it through these images, or idols, as the scripture says. But along with the man-made representations, the cultures and civilizations also developed rites and rituals as a way to honor God through their man-made representations. And eventually, as Israel began to move into the land after the Exodus, these cultural practices unfortunately rubbed off on the people of Israel. So if you put yourself in the position of Israel, they had all this religious programming. They had all this programming from Egypt, and then they also had programming from Babylon too, and the surrounding cultures. But if we take just a little bit of liberty here to spiritualize Egypt and Babylon and think about what I'm saying, it would be systems of worship simply not prescribed by God. Or you could look at it as worshiping God through a foreign culture and through a foreign system of worship. It's interesting. Because if you take this idea and then you compare it to today, and you compare it to 100 years ago, and you compare it to 300 years ago, It's unfortunate, seriously. Um, the model of the temple and the system of worship and the culture that he gave us originally, it was purposefully designed to point us to the Messiah later, right? So if you vary away from that, if you navigate away from that, you're not going to be able to recognize Messiah. And some of the practices today, we know for sure have pagan roots, right? That's part of why people are finally starting to wake up a little bit, I think. And so that qualifies too. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of what we're looking at. So there is a cycle that you can observe in Israel's history, and then you can also observe a cycle. It's called the Tytler cycle of the nations. So these two things overlap and coincide. It doesn't just apply to Israel, but since we have so much documentation for Israel, we can prove this out. You can also prove the other out, the Tytler cycle, just in looking at the history of the nations that we live in too. And so, it starts out like the one on the left starts out. We've got peace. We got the good times. We're serving God. Everything's good. Then Israel varies, or they have a little, they get off of the road. God punishes Israel. Israel is enslaved once again. Then Israel cries out to the Lord. Then God raises up a judge or a prophet, and Israel's delivered. Then you've got peace in the land again. And you see this cycle happen over and over and over again with Israel. But on the cycle of nation side, you have another cycle that exists too, where you go from bondage to great spiritual faith as a result of the bondage that you're in. Then you have liberty, abundance. The abundance turns into selfishness. Selfishness turns into complacency. Complacency turns into apathy. Then you go into dependence mode, and then right back into bondage. And we see that happen over and over and over again in the history of the history of nations. We're dangerously close to repeating this ourselves here in this country, honestly. And but the scripture says in 1 Corinthians 10, it says, these things happened as examples for us so that we wouldn't crave evil things just as they did, using this to reference the cycle of the nation that exists among Israel. And it was written to us so we wouldn't repeat these cycles. So in the past, the offerings to Molech were for strength and for fertility and also good weather, because it's an agricultural society. So what they would do is they would offer up their firstborn in hopes that they would have many children, ironically enough, a good crop, and also good weather for the harvests. So the societies were built on agriculture, and this agriculture required labor. So the job of these men and women were to feed their families through the harvest that were also weather dependent. So this is how they ended up in this mess. But today, we do things a little bit differently, if you sort of spiritualize that concept and then bring it over into today's society, the concept remains the same. So it would look more like not raising your own children, so as to still retain your personal freedom. You still have a successful career that you can carry out. You'll have plenty of time to make money. You'll have plenty of time to still do whatever it is that a person wants to do. And you'll also retain liberty to fulfill those desires. The problem, though, is children are expensive. They demand a lot of time and money. And people just want to do what they want to do, regardless of the consequences. And they definitely do not want to accept responsibility. So in their day, they were offering up their firstborn to Molech so that their harvest would be good. They'd have plenty of kids after that and all of those things. Today, we do the same thing. It's just we don't see it as being offered to Molech. We see it as being offered so that we can continue to do what we want to do and not have to face any of the consequences for our carnal desires. It's terrible, but it's the truth. Okay, how does Aleister Crowley fit into this? Well, I don't know, but basically what we're going to look at is the advances of modern man. So we want to look at the generation that came before us, and then maybe the previous one, to see if maybe some of the culture rubbed off on them too. And I'm not saying this to be rude. I'm just, I want to, hopefully everybody understands how we got here, like present day, how we got here. So this guy named Aleister Crowley, he was the pretty much the godfather of what they call modern day Satanism. He wrote a number of books. He referred to himself as the Beast. He's the one that actually coined the phrase, the modern version of this phrase. Basically what it says is, do what you want shall be the whole of the law. Meaning whatever benefits us, that's what we should do regardless of the consequences. So when the society reaches this point in the Tytler cycle that we just looked at, what comes next is dependence and loss of freedom, and then eventually slavery. That's just the way it is. I don't make the rules. It's just that's what the numbers and all of the data sets say. So how did he influence so many people? Well, he did it through the music. Definitely did it through the music. So these musicians were attracted to this guy. Some in Hollywood were too, but this is not about name dropping. It's just to basically say that the music shapes culture and behavior. That's the way it is. If you guys, I used to listen to a variety of music, and I can still tell you the lyrics today. Like, even though I haven't heard the song in 20 years. Well, what does that tell you? It's programmed. Well, the music hits you at the soul level, though. It's the problem. So, your behavior and your actions a lot of time are influenced by the behavior or by the music, and it's also influenced by the other programming that we have, which comes from this thing, But in the case of Aleister Crowley, these guys, these bands here, they were really attracted to this guy. So the Beatles, even, they put him on their album cover. They put him on their album cover. And it's because they were listening to his theology. They were listening to his methodology. They were reading his books. They were listening to what he had to say. And then his spirit, probably not even his, to be honest with you, was coming through in the music. Well, then who listens to the music? It's us, right? It's the previous generations. And so, you've got that thing working through music, and you've definitely got it working through programming on television, So when we, this is not replacement theology, but when we think about ourselves as being vulnerable, just like Israel was vulnerable to the other cultures, we're vulnerable too to the culture that exists in our own country, And so we have to, I think the prudent thing is to understand where it comes from, A, how to deal with it, B, and then not repeat the cycle of the previous generations. The previous generations, it was all about having a good time, free love, do what you want shall be the whole of your law. That was a large piece of the previous generations. And but the question is, what should we do? Like us in this room, the people that are listening, like, what do we do with this? Well, the definition of insanity is doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result, right? So we don't want to do that. What do we do when the world pushes Yeshua away from the society? Even in our culture, it pushes him away and says, no, I think I want a thief and a murderer instead. What do you do with that? Our culture is sort of in the stages of rejecting everything that made Western civilization great. It was built upon his precepts. To varying degrees, but for the most part it was. And so we're going to look at Gideon. It's basically what we're going to do, because there's some overlays in here that are beautiful for us in our time. There's also a lot of symbology here too, which we'll kind of get to some of that. But the big point that I hope everybody understands, and I really want to try to drive this home, is that the first 7/8 of the book, the older writings, When you look for Yeshua in those older writings, you will find him every time. And so the whole purpose of the first part of the book was to help us to realize Messiah when he came. And then the newer writings are all about Messiah and then what his future plans are for us, right? But if we don't know the first 7/8 of the book, don't really care about that. That's the old stuff. Get rid of it. That was for the Jews. Don't worry about that. If you approach it that way, then you're going to look at your current culture in this modern version of replacement theology, and you will end up in a place where you have an entire system of worship. It's unfortunate, right? But you'll end up with an entire system of worship that is not according to his prescription. In other words, we do a lot of things today that come from other cultures. And if we've been grafted into the same tree as Israel, they don't take on our roots because we're the wild olive branch that's been grafted in. We need to look at Israel and see what it is that he commanded them to do. What does he say for us to do? All of those things. What we've done today, though, is we've said, well, this is what I want to do to honor God, and we've ran with that. Well, unfortunately, and I'm really trying to dumb this down and not be too rude here, but unfortunately, you can make the biblical case that is idolatry 101, And so maybe a whole lot of people don't know this, Maybe it's the first time somebody's hearing it. I really hate to be the one to say it, but as he continues to wake the people up, the first thing that they're going to do is probably the same thing that I did and the same thing that you guys did too, which is to say, what have we been doing? That sort of behavior. What have we been doing? And then you rediscover the roots of the faith that come from Israel that God gave them. And then it's like, man, why don't we just do this? Well, I'd rather do Easter. Okay, well, why not just do first fruits, man? That's the biblical day. And the counter argument to that would be, well, that was for the Jews. So you're saying that first fruits was for the Jews, but Easter is for the Gentiles? That Easter is for us, but you know what? You see where I'm going with that? It's just crazy. It's really pretty crazy. But I don't want to get on a tangent about that. But in Judges chapter 6, we're going to do some reading here. It's we're in the final death blows of the cycle that Israel repeats over and over and over again. And here you have this man that is raised up named Gideon. And so the cycle has been complete. Israel has gone way off track here. The surrounding cultures have rubbed off on them again. They have entered into a system of worship that is not prescribed by Yahweh at all. It's a way that the surrounding cultures have used to honor him or other gods made in their own image. So it says the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord handed them over to Midian. This is where we were talking about on their journey. This is when they were in Midian. And the power of Midian prevailed against Israel. And because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains and the caves and the stronghold. For when Israel had sown their crops, the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the people of the east and marched against them. So they would camp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, nor a sheep, nor a donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents, and they would come in like locusts in number, and both they and their camels were innumerable. And they came into the land to ruin it, so Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel began to cry out to the Lord. Now it came about when the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of Midian, that the Lord sent a prophet to the sons of Israel, and he said to them, "This is what the Lord God says," the Lord of Israel, God of Israel says, "It was I who brought you up from Egypt. This is when you look this word up, Egypt, you get some explanation here. I've included that. And brought you out of the house of slavery. And I rescued from the hands of the Egyptians and from the hands of all your oppressors. And I drove them out from you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not obeyed me. So this is the end of the cycle. Then the angel of the Lord, which when you look this word up, when you look up angel, and when you look in the original languages, you'll see that it's Malach Yehovah or Malach Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. So this is angel of the Lord. Came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, not Oprah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. So this is him trying to save some of their harvest because Midian was giving them a bunch of trouble. And so they were trying to save some food, essentially. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, valiant warrior. Then Gideon said to him, oh, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? You know, it's kind of a question that you ask sometimes. And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did the Lord not bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to Midian. So this is where the text gets really interesting, because before it's talking about angel of the Lord, you have Malach Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh there. But in 14, it says, and Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh looked at him and said, so this is the difference in the verbiage. So you've got angel of the Lord, and then you've got the Lord himself in verse 14. It says that he looked at him and said, go in the strength of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? But he said to him, O Lord, how am I to save Israel? My family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. Yet he said to him, I will certainly be with you, and I will defeat Midian, and you will defeat Midian as one man. So Gideon said to him, so you can already start to see the Messiah, the type of Messiah, the Messiah architecture built in. Gideon being the representative here. So Gideon said to him, if I now have found favor in your sight, then perform for me a sign that it is you speaking with me. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you and bring out my offering and lay it before you. And he said, I will remain until you return. Then Gideon went in and prepared a young goat. He prepared some unleavened bread, and he put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, and brought them out to him under the oak and presented them. And the angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. So think about Messiah sort of architecture here. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand, and he touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and then fire came up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And then the angel of the Lord vanished. So when you look at this, you've got you've definitely got symbolism here. And this is an actual event that took place, but you've got all the embedded symbolism that represents Messiah that we got to pay attention to here. So you've got a lamb or a young goat, you've got unleavened bread, which, you know, we always talk about it all the time, how he was the Passover lamb. Included in the Passover is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you've got that present. And there's a number of other places you can plug and play with this stuff. But then he said to lay them on this rock. You know, well, Messiah said that it was upon this rock that he was going to build his church, which is the faith that the apostle had in himself, in the Messiah himself. Then the angel of the Lord vanished. when Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord, he said, "Oh my God," basically, is what he's saying. "For I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, 'Peace to you, do not be afraid, you shall not die.' Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and named it, 'The Lord is Peace,' or Shalom. And to this day it is still there." I don't know if it is today, but in this day it was. "Now on the same night, the Lord said to him, 'Take your father's bull and a second bull, 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal, which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it.'" So we see that Gideon's own father was engaged in this sort of activity, but all the people were too. Not all, but most. "And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this stronghold in an orderly way, and take a second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you're going to cut down." Then Gideon took 10 men from his servants and did as the Lord had spoken to him. And because he was too afraid of his father's household, his own household, our fathers have inherited lies. It's the same thing processed over and over and over. But because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he did it by night. So when you look at Gideon's offering, what does he bring out? He brings out a lamb. He brings out unleavened bread, and then he places it upon the rock. And in Deuteronomy 32:15, it's speaking of the rock of salvation. And when you look up that word salvation, it's Yeshua. It's basically all the internal components to pronounce the Messiah's name. So when we read stuff like this, even though these are events that have definitely taken place, this whole book points to Messiah. So he's going to be embedded and encoded everywhere within it. But then he offers the bull, and that was for his own sin, because the offering of the lamb was for the sin of the people. When you look at the Day of Atonement and you superimpose it onto what Gideon actually did, you really have all the components for the Day of Atonement to work. It's interesting. So on the Day of Atonement, you have the sin offering for the people, and then you have the sin offering for the priest. And then it's supposed to be an offering made by fire. Anytime you see that there's a few of these references in Scripture where the offering was fully consumed, the fire came down from heaven and the offering was fully consumed, that's basically his stamp of approval and saying, yes, this is right. And so when we look at this, he's basically saying, yes, my son is right. Yeshua is right. The Messiah is right. You know, even though this is something that actually happened in the history of Israel, there was another person that was supposed to come from the tribe of Israel that was going to be the actual Gideon, the literal embodiment of Gideon here. So the Day of Atonement, we've talked about this before, but it's literally like a day of reckoning, but it's also a day of restoration too. So it's reckoning for those who worship God, but through their own system, right? So you've got this own system that has been created. It's basically a splicing together of traditions that come from our culture, other cultures, and that makes up the system of worship that we adhere to and abide by. So for them, it's a reckoning. But for us, you know, for the people that worship him in a way that he prescribes, although not perfectly, we're still trying to get there. You know, everybody's in a varying degree of their journey, and so we're all still learning. This is relatively new for a lot of people, so we're trying to get there. But really what this is about is trying to restore the system that he gave us in the first place, not in the form of the temple and sacrifices, but through the realized example of the temple and the offered sacrifice, which is the fulfillment found in Messiah. It's restoration also for those who will follow his systems, which is simply to say that they're obedient to his ways and motivated from a place of love and reverence. Love definitely missing, reverence extraordinarily missing. You know, we're just too casual with the way that we approach his ways, really. I'm not talking to you guys. I'm just simply saying it. But we'll continue here. It says, when the people of the city got up early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal had been torn down, and the Asherah which had been beside it had been cut down. And the second bull has been offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, who did this thing? This is the people of the town here saying, who did this? And when they searched and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing. And then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die, for he has torn down the altar of Baal, and indeed he has also cut down the Asherah which was beside it. But Joash said to all those who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? So he's basically saying, hey, look, he's not God if he can be cut down by human hands. He's God if he lays his own life down on his own volition, which is exactly what Messiah did. But Joash is saying he can't be God if he can be torn down by human hands and bulls. If he is God, let him contend for himself, since someone has torn down his altar, Therefore, on that day, he named Gideon Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he has torn down his altar. Then all the Midianites, all the Amalekites, and the people of the east assembled together as a result of this thing, and they crossed over and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So the Spirit of the Lord covered Gideon like clothing. He blew a trumpet. This is all messianic symbolism here, every bit of it. Yes, it's an actual thing that happened, but it's all symbolism. And how do I say this word? I've been struggling with this word today. Abiezerites, yes, were called together to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they also were called together to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. Then Gideon said, and think about what he's saying here. This is Gideon speaking, but again, this is more about messianic symbolism than it is about Gideon himself, although the thing with Gideon did happen. But Gideon says to God, if you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me as you have spoken. So the sign that he's looking for is the sign that would be perpetrated on the produce of the lamb, so it's representative of the lamb. It's interesting. When he arose the next morning, he squeezed the fleece and he drained the dew from the fleece. He ends up with a bowl of water, it says. Then Gideon said to God, do not let your anger burn against me, that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry on the fleece, and let there be dew on the ground only. And God did so that night, for it was dry on the fleece, and there was dew on all the ground. So you look at the sign of the fleece, it's like, okay, well, what he did is he prayed, and he said, okay, if the fleece is dry, then this is good. If the fleece is wet, then we're still in good shape. But when you look at this fleece of wool, this is the produce of the lamb. This is like something inherent that the lamb produces. It's a fleece. But embedded in this coat of wool, there's a substance found that has waterproof properties. That's why this animal is so rugged. And it's called lanolin. When you look up these words in the Latin, it's literally the building blocks of the words linoleum. And it means wool for lana, and then oil for oleum. And so, it's a waterproofing material. It's oil, right? So when you think about the symbology involved in Messiah, oil represents the Spirit of God, right? It's the oil of the Holy Ghost. And so he does this on the threshing floor. This is where the sign is perpetrated here. And this is where historically you would have somebody with a winnowing fork. You would have this big pile of wheat embedded in the wheat. You'd have the tares and then some of the trash with it too, but they're trying to extract the wheat only, and you do this with a winnowing fork. And so when you look at other places in the scripture, especially the parable of the wheat and chaff, the wheat are the sons that are of an obedient nature. These are the sons that obey God. And then the chaff are the sons that are separated because of their disobedience. Another way to think about it is the sheep and the goats. We talked about that before. It's the differing natures of the sheep and the goats. But in this case, it's wheat and tares or chaff. So in Matthew chapter 3, John the Baptist says about Yeshua, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will thoroughly clear his threshing floor. He will gather his wheat into the barn, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. But Gideon goes on to say, he says in that passage we just read, if you are going to save Israel, perform a sign and do it with a lamb, is essentially what he's saying. And this lamb naturally produces the oil, and the oil is a retardant to water, but you have the involvement in the water there. The oil is produced so as to be waterproof, but the sign is to be done on the threshing floor. So you have all this embedded symbolism in the scriptures that are only for the Jews, right? And this is just like one example. We could go throughout the whole old writings, and you can find over and over and over and over again this symbolism that represents the Messiah. But yet, that's the old stuff. We don't pay attention to that, right? With their replacement theology, they have replaced the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I hate to be the one to do this, but that's essentially what they've done. And this new system has emerged that comes from the other cultures. It doesn't come from his culture, for sure. And so, I'm just simply saying that you should be very careful on what you say to throw out and what you say to keep, because everything still applies, all of his word applies to us. Yes, some are still examples for us. Some are models, like the temple, for example. This is the temple now, but in the past it was the tent of meeting and the temple of Israel. But all of that was designed to teach us something. And all of these stories, all these historical accounts are meant to teach us something too. And it's meant to teach us about Messiah. Every bit of it. Everywhere you look, you'll find this stuff. We'll keep going. Then Gideon and all the people who were with him got up early and camped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to hand over Midian over to them. Otherwise, Israel would become boastful, saying, my own power has saved me. Now therefore come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is afraid and worried about this, what's coming next, you're to go back and leave Mount Gilead. And so 22,000 people returned, but 10,000 remained. Then the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. So it shall be that he of whom I say to you, that this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. But every one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, you shall put everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps in one group, and everyone who kneels down to drink in another. Now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people kneeled down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, I'll tell you what, I'll save you with the 300 men who lapped. This was like in a negative connotation. And I will hand the Midianites over to you. So have all the other people go, each man to his own home. So this is like, you guys have seen the movie 300? This is like the original 300, essentially. And so Gideon dismissed all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Now, on that same night, it came about that the Lord said to him, Arise, go down against the camp, for I have handed it over to you. But if you're afraid to go down, go with Purah, your servant, down to the camp, so that you will hear what they say. So this is God saying, go down to their camp and listen to what they're going to say. Not what I'm telling you to say, but listen to what they're going to say. And after you hear these things, you will have the courage to go down against the camp. So he went down with his servant to the outpost of the army that was in the camp. It's cut off a little bit here. But it says, now the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all of the people of the east were in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend, and he said, Behold, I had a dream. This is in the camp of the enemy. Behold, I had a dream, and in this dream a loaf of barley, a loaf of bread, was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell. And it turned upside down so that the tent collapsed. So the bread that causes the tents of the nations to collapse is basically what we're talking about here. The tents are turned upside down, and the enemies of Israel and the plan of the nations come to nothing. This is like telling of this time, but it's also telling about a future time. And how is that possible? Well, it's because Yeshua, the showbread in the temple, he's the bread of life in the newer writings. The showbread was meant to reveal to us that he was the bread of life for the priest, essentially. But we'll get to that. When Gideon heard the account of this dream, we're skipping. But the friend replied, the friend in the enemy camp replied, This is nothing other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. And God has handed over to him Midian and all the camp. Did he get it? Thank you. Thank you, Josh. So the dream goes, he sees this loaf of bread tumbling down, and it hits their tents. The tents go upside down, and there's a problem, obviously. But the people in the camp of the enemy are like, oh no, this is speaking of the sword of Gideon. This is speaking of the archetype or the representation of Messiah through Gideon, essentially. You can take this a number of ways. Yeah, exactly. When Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship. And then he returned to the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has handed over to you the camp of Midian. And he divided the 300 men into 3 units, and he put trumpets and empty pitchers into the hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. Then he said to me, Look at me and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I and all who with me blow the trumpet, then you also blow the trumpets around the entire camp and say, For the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 300 men were with him, came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle of the night watch, when they had just posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. Then the 300 units blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers. They held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing, and shouted, A sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And each stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran, crying out as they fled. And when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one another, of one against the other of the enemy camp, and throughout the entire army. And the army fled as far as Bathsheba, towards Zerera, and as far as the edges of Abel Mahola by Tubbath. And the men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali, Asher, and all of Manasseh, and they pursued Midian. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, Come down against Midian and take control of the waters ahead of them, as far as Bethbara and the Jordan. So all of the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took control of the waters, and they captured 2 leaders, and they brought the heads basically back across the Jordan River. But I've built a little list here. So this is all the symbolism in the account of Gideon. You have the angel of the Lord, You have Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh himself. In the languages, it says Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh himself. Then you have the Spirit covering Gideon. You have the blowing of trumpets. You have a Savior in the form of Gideon from Israel. Gideon being the shadow picture of Messiah. And he basically annihilates the foreign gods in the land and delivers Israel. Right? So how does he do this? Well, he does it with a bull, with the bulls, but he tears down the Asherah poles. He tears down he basically tears down the false system that is operating in the land. So Gideon does this, but we're also awaiting for that day prophetically to take place too, where Messiah returns. He destroys the plans of the tent of the nations. So you have Gideon as a prophet. You have a lamb, which was Gideon's offering for the people. You have the oil that comes from the lamb's skin. You have the unleavened bread, which is also included in Gideon's offering. You have the rock where the offering was made, which was on the rock. You have a pouring out of the broth, which I'm reaching here a little bit, but you can see it as the Messiah's blood being poured out for all of us. You also have an element of fire in there where the angel of the Lord touches his staff to the sacrifice and it's fully consumed, which is a sign that God says, yes, I like this. This is my stamp of approval. You also have an altar there. You have a bull, and then you have the bread of barley, which really, when you start thinking about it, I mean, it's the body of Messiah. So then you have the water from the fleece, which you can take that 1,000 different directions, but I just put baptism here for simplicity. But in the dream, you have this bread of barley, this Messiah coming down to the tent of the nations, collapsing their tent, overthrowing their system of worship, and God giving Israel what was formerly theirs. You know, so it's a lot of symbolism embedded there, and I hope you guys enjoyed that piece. But there's a lot there. I could literally live here in this 6, 7, and 8 for a long time and just continue to mine this stuff out. But the whole point here is that God has a system. He has patterns and things that are recorded in the older writings. Those patterns are all to point us to Messiah. They're all designed to point us towards Yeshua so that we can recognize him for who he is. But it becomes increasingly difficult to recognize him when we are operating apart from his system. Very difficult to do. And so anyways, we're simply trying to do is to return to his system in a way that pleases him, but also not in a way that is so strictly focused on the physical applications of his system that was for Israel in the land in that time period. You know, you want to kind of get away from some of the physicality of it and look more at the weightier matter or the implied meaning of the pattern, which is embodied in Yeshua himself, the Messiah. So that's all I've got for you guys.